All right, and we've gone ahead and created all these characters for use in our scene, and we're finally ready to import them into our main palace file and finish the scene up completely. So before we do that, let's do a tiny bit of upkeep here. So instead of copying and pasting all these individual main objects into the other Blender file this time, like we did with the landscape files, let's try just copying and pasting some instances. So to show you what I mean here, let's grab this whole guard plus his sword objects and belt and everything there. And let's put him into a new collection called Guard 1. And now, like we've done before, we'll just select that new collection, right click it, and instance to scene. And that'll take a second, probably because there's so many complex materials in here. So by the way, let's switch over to solid mode so it runs a little bit faster. And let's set the origin of that instance to the geometry. And now it'll be floating right above him. So now we can just copy and paste that instance into our other file, and everything will look correct, and we won't be able to edit it in the other file, but that's completely fine because everything's stored here. So let's do that for each of these sets. And I've sped up the video here, just going to be doing that exact same instancing process for each one of these characters. Now, for the king and the queen, let's not do this process because we still want to keep the armatures and we still want to potentially make some edits to them in the other file. So we'll just we'll import their entire geometry over. All right, so let's give this a shot. So let's start out with one of these spear characters. So I'll Control C, and it's telling us right there, copied one selected objects. And if I switch over to our main palace file, and now if I hit Control V, so let's go ahead and move that instance, the M key, back to the balcony collection. All right, so now we should be able to get a feel for this character. Let's place them, generally speaking, on our little balcony here. And the end goal is to replace all these red cube characters with our fully realized character. So let's try and scale it, generally speaking, to the same eye level as the red cube people. That's pretty close. And we're seeing, even though this is just an instance, we can't edit it or anything, but it came in with all the correct materials, so that's all looking good. So let's put that there for now. Let's go back over to our file. Let's try grabbing this collection. I'll just copy, and then I will paste. And I've sped up the video here once again. I'll just be rearranging those foreground characters on the balcony. And in the back of my mind, I'm trying to tell a little bit of a story where we'll have the king and queen in the front, and then their guards and bodyguards sort of arrayed around them. So in this case, it's not good enough just to select one of these objects. What we actually want to do, I'll hit period to jump to the full armature collection, is we'll select this, this kind of piece that the queen is contained within, and right click, and we'll choose select hierarchy. That'll select everything within there that's parented to the armature. And now if we hit Control C, it should copy everything within there. You see there's 3 different objects. I think that's the dress, the rest of it, and the armature. And now if we paste this over here, take a second to calculate. And let's go find where that pasted, make sure it's in the balcony collection again. And same process, just move it over here. And again, this queen is not an instance, so she'll be completely editable. If we want to, still update the pose a little bit, if we want to, update the materials, that should all be completely doable. And since this is kind of a main hero character, we might still want to make some adjustments. So, generally speaking, we'll just put her here for now. And let's go grab the king as well. And I just want to get these characters in here before we start placing all of our walking characters, which will be in the more distant areas. So again, I'll right click and select his whole hierarchy, Control C to copy, and paste him over to the scene. It'll take a second. Let's go jump to where he pasted, and let's make sure he's in the balcony collection. Could probably switch it. We're getting a little bit of lag now because there's so many different complex textures in here. There's a lot of geometry, so I probably should switch over to solid mode just for ease of use, and things should run a little bit faster. Oops. All right, so let's just generally place him in the right spot here. Standing here next to the queen. And again, we'll figure out the exact layout of all these characters here on the balcony in a bit. But let's just get everything sorted. Scale's feeling about right. See, we'll have to adjust his hands a little bit so that they're resting on the balcony railing, but that's why we kept it editable, so that I can still adjust his pose if we need to. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's actually check that in material preview here. And now that this is getting so dense and complex, I just want to mention something you can do to hopefully make your scenes run a little bit faster. And that is, if you go over here to edit, open up your preferences, and click on make sure you're on this viewport option. You want to make sure that you've limited the size of your textures in the viewport to something really small, like 512. By default, I think that's on off. So that means you can have any, the huge resolutions of the textures which you might have imported. If you limit the size to something small, which I've done already, then things should run a little bit faster, a little bit smoother. But again, that's just in the viewport. When you actually make a render, everything will be high res. So we might even change that to 256. Should make things run even faster. And X out of that. All right, I'll just save here really quick. It's probably taking a second because there's all this new information. There we go. All right, let's delete these foreground cubes. Actually, before we do that, I just want to scale up a couple of these in relation to them. I think they could be a tiny bit bigger, just so that we don't get confused later. And the same for the queen and the king as well. So I'll select her hierarchy. Actually, in this case, since I'm just scaling, I could just select the armature, since everything is parented to that, and just scale her up a tiny bit. Actually, the king looks pretty good. All right, so let's delete these default kind of placement cubes and kind of take a look at how our scene is shaping up. So let's think about the layout here. I'm just kind of thinking these would be some bodyguards that would be up close. Here's our hero characters. Let's make sure that their feet are not sinking into the floor. It's okay if they do just a little. And maybe these characters, I like how they're in the foreground, kind of talking to each other. We might make them even closer to camera in a second, but let's see how all this is looking in rendered view. So this will probably take a second to calculate now that there's all these new materials to think about. So let's save here for sure and switch over to rendered view. Just need to make sure if the general values of our textures and materials are working within this lighting scenario, and if we need to do any kind of drastic changes before we move forward. So let's take a look here. So let's zoom in a bit. This foreground area is, it's not getting any direct sunlight, so everything needs to read kind of with this ambient light that we have going. And I'm kind of thinking it could, I think like these silhouettes are popping even though they're not getting any direct light. So that we're getting, dark reads against light reads. And I think when we add in extra mist and light atmosphere behind them in the 2D phase, all this foreground will start reading much better. So I think this is going to work out, and it's a good direction to keep going. Even though it is reading somewhat in here in the foreground, I think we can maybe help out the lighting here just a little bit by enhancing some of this ambient here. So we've placed the 3D cursor here. Let's see what happens if we add in an area light. And that'll probably take a second. And it'll just place right there. What happens if we just scale it up a bit? And let's put it just above all our foreground characters here. And it's pointing down at them, so it should feel a little bit like an ambient skylight. And I think it's starting to help. Let's up the power from 10 to something like 100. And we'll start to see that it's lighting up all these foreground characters just a bit better. And then, again, in 2D, we'll balance the contrast so that this foreground is nice and dark and pops against this midground. But let's at least get ourselves some light information to work with, so that we can really see all the designs we worked so hard in. So yeah, we can also maybe try adjusting the color of that ambient to more feel like a skylight. I don't necessarily mind white, but let's just see what happens if we tint it a little bit towards blue, so that it does start to feel like the top of that sky is just reflecting downwards. And I think that is starting to feel quite nice. Got to be careful that it doesn't kind of cross over into the trees. We might get a weird effect. So let's just shrink that a little bit. And I think something like that is we're gonna be happy with the amount of information that's giving us in the foreground. And I've sped up the video here. All I'm going to be doing is just doing the exact same process for these characters, sort of walking around the scene. So I'll start with this sort of walking path bridge area, and I'll just sort of place them, while checking from the camera view, just to make sure that they, feel about right. And of course, we checked it against the scale of those red blockout characters before we, duplicated them all around. So these are just instances, once again, so we can kind of add in quite a few here without worrying too much about the heaviness on the scene. But a lot of these won't really end up in the final product because they're just too far away from the camera. All right, we're finally ready to start making some renders here. Everything's set up the way we wanted, and we're going to talk about how to organize the file in a way that is very intelligent, I think, for setting up when you're doing a huge render like this. So what we don't want to do is have absolutely everything in the scene showing and make one giant render. First of all, it'll take much longer to render that way. And then also it might even be more difficult to work with in Photoshop with just everything in one final render. So what we want to do is do some render passes, and then we'll comp them together in Photoshop. And I've kind of worked out a way that works for me to kind of make that really as easy as possible. So just take a look at how I've organized some of these collections. So the way we want to do this is have our foreground elements all together rendered at once, and then our midground objects all together, and then finally our background objects all together. So what you're seeing right now is everything I'm going to render that's quote unquote my midground. So in my collections, that's just everything that I didn't color or was green from before, but that's just sort of the midground elements. And then you'll see I put all the background mountains into a collection, and I've just unchecked it here. So if I turn all those on, you'll see we're getting all those elements back there. And it's important to note, if you just hit the letter H to hide them, it will still show up in the render. So you actually want to put them into their own collection and then uncheck that collection, and then it won't render. So let's hide those again. And then just so you're understanding what's going on, I also have the foreground objects in their own collection. So if we check on this balcony collection, for example, there's all our characters. And then I even have these trees as their own collection. I'm thinking I might render those separately as well. And then finally, this midground kind of tower I have as its own element. And my reasoning is just that I think I might want some mist in between these layers or a slight bit of atmosphere in Photoshop, and it'll be much easier if we kind of separate them this way. So let's hide all that. And let me just show you some of the render passes I'm going to do here. So first of all, we're not just going to go ahead and click render image. We're going to think about this a little bit further. So the first thing we really want to do, make sure is checked on here is if you go over here to the render properties, scroll down, you'll see this film dropdown, and you want to unfurl that and check on this transparent option. And what that will do is it'll make everything, all the background here, transparent. So if I switch over to rendered view, we should see that. And we'll do that for every single layer here that we kind of composite together. So if I zoom in, you'll see we're getting that checkered transparent background, and that'll just make everything so much easier to work with if we have that on. Now there's kind of a caveat with that. And that is, I don't know if you can tell, but there's actually, the mist is affecting that transparency. So if you look over here to the left, you'll see it's a little bit darker in the background versus over here on the right, it's a little bit brighter. And that is this mist volume that we had added in way before. That's this cube. And that is actually kind of ruining the transparency effect. So if we were to render this, we would actually have a little bit of pixel information, even where it's meant to be transparent. But I think it's actually worth it to render with this mist on. I mean, excuse me, the alternative is just to check it off, right? And then you get a perfect transparency. But it doesn't look as, perfect. And the mist is, I think, adding a lot to sell the scene. So let's check that back on. And all we need to do to kind of get around that slight hiccup with the mist is we'll do this render, and then we'll do another render. And to do that, we'll go into this regular, like solid shading, and then unfurl this option right here, and check on random, and then check on flat as well. And you get this kind of clown render. And we talked about this a little bit in our overview of Blender. But basically, this will help us make a really clean selection with all these different elements once we have everything in Photoshop. And then additionally, if we were to viewport render this, so to viewport render, instead of hitting regular render image or the hotkey for that, you actually click this view option and then click on viewport render image. And you'll see it happens super fast because it's not that complicated a thing to render. And then additionally, you see you are getting this nice transparent background now because there's no mist information. So we'll use this kind of transparency as a nice clean selection in Photoshop. And I'll show you what I'm talking about when we get into Photoshop. But this will be a really important kind of step. So that's kind of how we're going to get around that. And then additionally, we're going to make a couple extra render passes. So we're going to do this clown render for each layer that we're going to render, foreground, midground, and background. And then we're also going to do a couple other passes for the ones that we think need it. And that is the mist, another additional mist render pass and a normal pass. So real quick, what I'm talking about with the mist, I don't know if we talked about that in the Intro to Blender. I think we did just briefly, but just to show you what I'm talking about, you have to go over here into this passes or this kind of stacked JPEG menu. And you want to make sure if you scroll up here under passes that this mist option is checked on, and then also check on the normal option while you're here. And what that will do is, we will, when we do finally render this, we'll get a couple extra passes in the render. But first we want to kind of double check on them to make sure that we're seeing everything we want to be seeing. So in order to do that, let's click on this material view. And I already have it set to the mist, but if it's not looking like that, unfurl this little check, this little menu here. Oh, it might take a second. Mispass is actually quite heavy sometimes. All right, so that's right here. So you see I already have it set to mist under render pass. Normally it would be on combined, and that would be the regular material view. But if you just check on this mist option, then you'll be seeing the mist pass. And you also want to adjust it. So right now it's not that useful in Mispass because it's almost completely black and white, and you don't want that. You kind of want a nice transition from gray to light. So in order to adjust it, you have to click over to the world properties, and you'll have this Mispass option that is now there because we checked on the Mispass. And you can adjust the start and depth of the mist. So right now it's kind of set way too high. So if we change the start to kind of really close to camera, maybe even 0, you'll see already we're getting a nice kind of the kind of Mispass that we want, which is things in the foreground are a lot darker and they gradually get lighter as they go back. But you can also adjust the depth to kind of change that around. So right now it's on 3000. If I change that to 1000, you'll see well, we're getting some changes there. You can also adjust the fall off type. So right now it's on linear. You can try quadratic, and it'll probably be a more dramatic kind of transition. So let's say we were happy with that. All we would have to do, first of all, you could do the final render, and then you could grab this Mispass from there. But what I like to do is just do another viewport render. So viewport render, and it'll just kind of, viewport render is basically just like a screenshot of what you have in the viewport, but it's nice and high res, and it'll match the resolution that we've set. So we can just save that out now. So that's the Mispass. And then finally, the normal pass, and we can do that the exact same way. So let's unfurl this menu, go down here, and change it to the normal, which remember we checked on in this menu. And this is kind of the normal pass. It's a bit ugly, but it can be very useful in the Photoshop stage for making selections. So basically, you have a different color here based on which direction geometry is facing. And you can use that to make selections in Photoshop to kind of cheat extra lighting information, or kind of, you can use it in quite a lot of ways. So it is quite useful. So let's just do another viewport render, and we'll save that out. So I'm going to make, for each kind of midground, or for each layer here, the foreground, midground, background, possibly a couple more steps in between, I'm going to do all 4 of these passes. I'm going to do the regular render, the multicolored clown render, the mist pass, and I might adjust the depth of the mist per layer to make it kind of have a nice gradation for each step. And then finally the normal pass. And we might not need all of those for every single one. Mainly it's just this kind of midground that needs all of those. We'll see. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of skip ahead, and I'll show you how everything's looking in Photoshop once I have all those. One quick note though, doing it in steps like this is possibly going to affect the lighting a little bit. So I did have to make a slight change. So let me just show you what I mean here. So if I check on the foreground balcony, and then if we check off all this extra stuff, right, which we would do if we were doing the balcony pass, because all that kind of lighting information is now not there, if we look at this in render view, it'll actually change some of what we're seeing. First of all, we won't be getting reflections of things that we turned on the ground plane, but then also, and you'll kind of see this here, we're getting light that we didn't necessarily want. It's kind of cool looking. We might try it out, but there used to be geometry over here that was blocking the light. So just so that we kind of have an option that's exactly like what we intended, all I did is add in the shadow blocker cube. And this cube's only purpose is to block the light for this balcony pass. So I know the light's coming from here, so I just placed a big cube there, and you'll see now it's throwing all this into shadow. So we might need that shadow blocker just for the foreground trees and the foreground balcony. And again, that's its only purpose, is just for this pass, and we'll turn it off when we render the midground. So hopefully that's all making sense. I'm going to make a bunch of renders now, and I'll see you on the other side, and we'll talk about how to get started in Photoshop.